Captain Segolide, you are at the helm of a ship that has smashed into the helm of the Redacted. Your fireball has set fire to the mast, and it looks like you're winning the fight, when you suddenly hear the dreaded sounds of the approaching Tyrannosaurus shark. What do you do?
Hi, welcome to Kraken Week. This is my contribution to the event created by Ginny D and Pointy Hat for D&D creators all over the internet to make aquatic-themed videos. I don't have a heck of a lot to offer for like stat blocks for Krakens and things because I haven't yet homebrewed my own Kraken or anything like that, but in the Tales of the Misfits game and the Adventures of Azarim game, both of the campaigns that I run for Viva la Dirt League, back to back, I happened to be underwater with both of them. Those episodes haven't come out yet, so I'm going to have to be careful about spoilers, but I had reason to review the underwater rules in the Player's Handbook and come up with my own direction for how they work. So that's what we're going to go over today, how I run underwater adventures. I'll say right off the bat, these rules are only for if your table enjoys them. As with all rules, I make sure that my players are the sorts of people who would enjoy the sort of nitty-gritty rules that I've come up with here, and if there is a table that would prefer to handwave that sort of stuff, then any of the things here are not sacrilege. I could ignore them, bend them, break them, completely change them on the fly if needed. As I see it, there are 4 major questions to answer when you're doing anything underwater in D&D. How are you breathing? How are you seeing? How are you moving? And how are you fighting? The easiest one there is the seeing. I just take into account the fact that light only penetrates so far under the water. And so after you are diving deeper and deeper into the ocean, you're seeing less and less. In my games, I tend to use more low light vision than dark vision. So if you have dark vision, yes, it will help, but you'll still only see things in shades of grey. And even then, only when there is some amount of light. If you're deep down in the bottom of the ocean, there is no light, you can't see anything, it's pitch black. So all that to say, basically you're going to need some sort of illumination. If you're using campfires and torches, they're not going to work underwater. But if you've got an oil lantern, well, I don't want to spoil anything about either of the games that I mentioned, but the ways around illumination that they came up with proves to be interesting. Now, let's go back to breathing, because that should be a pretty big problem for a lot of people. Obviously, if you're an aquatic race or you have amphibious nature or you naturally can breathe underwater, then not an issue for you. You can breathe underwater, you can speak underwater, you can be heard underwater, no problem. I tend to think about Aquan as a language as being one of the things that is designed to be spoken underwater. It has evolved underwater, and therefore it can be heard underwater without sounding garbled. If you're choosing to hold your breath underwater in my games, I look at your Constitution modifier. You can hold your breath for a number of minutes equal to your Constitution modifier, minimum 1, but that's if you're not doing anything too stressful or strenuous. Say if you were just popping under a lake to hide and stealth as some army marched by, you can hold your breath a number of minutes. But obviously if you're doing something too strenuous or dangerous, stressful, if you're fighting, you're swimming away from something dangerous, your metabolism is using the oxygen up, you're not going to be able to hold your breath as much as you would under ideal circumstances. And so in those circumstances, I just say you can hold your breath a number of rounds equal to your Constitution modifier, minimum 1. If you're still underwater at the time that your breath runs out, you drop to 0 hit points and you start to die. At that point, you cannot regain hit points, you cannot succeed on any death saving throws, you cannot be stabilized until you get oxygen in your lungs. Obviously, I can't come up with rules for every possible minutiae of any particular circumstance. Somebody might use the Kiss of Life underwater and pass their oxygen to you, at which point I would probably rule it that you return to having a number of rounds equal to your Constitution modifier, something like that. And then maybe you can be stabilized or regain hit points or something at that point. If you choose to breathe underwater by using magic air, there is a spell called Air Bubble that puts a bubble of air around your head. There's also the Cap of Water Breathing, which puts a bubble of air around your head. I tend to use those more like scuba diving. I think of them as like magically compressed air that you're breathing. And the benefit of that is that you are breathing and speaking air. There is air moving over your vocal cords and out of your mouth. And so you can still cast your verbal spells without problem. You can still speak to your fellow companions and be heard. But the downside is you're breathing compressed air. So again, if it's a party of people at my table that prefer that sort of gritty consequences for their actions and things, a little bit more realistic nature, then I would consider giving them the bends when they come to the surface again if they go too quickly. I would make them make constitution checks against poison, or give them the poisoned condition or exhaustion or something like that. Then there's other magic like water breathing, which doesn't put a bubble of air around you but just allows you to breathe water. The way that I see that is that you take water into your lungs, and then much like a fish does, your body is just designed to take the oxygen out of the water rather than oxygen from the air. At that point, no risk of the bends because you're not breathing compressed air, but the detriment is that you cannot necessarily speak too easily because now water is passing over your vocal cords instead of air, and it changes the way that you sound. So speaking becomes a little more difficult, your words become more garbled, and how that pays off in a fun way when you're trying to cast magic is if you are trying to cast a verbal component spell, I have you roll a percentage check, and there is a 10% chance that the spell casts a different spell instead. So rather than use a wild magic table for that, I look at the casting time, the school of magic, and the action economy, whether it's an action or bonus action to cast. And then I find another spell that looks through all of those. Easy enough to find online with resources you can filter by. And then there's a 10% chance that the weave of magic around you, you accidentally use the verbal components of a very similar spell but different and accidentally cast something else. And it can have hilarious results. Okay, so now we can breathe underwater and we can see underwater. How are we moving about underwater? Rules is written, you're just moving at half speed unless you've got a swim speed. Obviously, if you've got a swim speed, movement's not an issue. If you don't have a swim speed, I do use the half movement speed because it makes sense. You're not able to swim as fast as you can walk. But I also take into account that that's not very fun. If you're just doing a single in and out combat in the water, then no problem. But if you are doing an entire session or two underwater, it can get a little tedious to constantly only be moving at half your speed. And so generally I give you like bursts of energy. I give you the ability to sprint underwater. And how that's represented is you basically look at your constitution modifier once again, and you can, that number of times per session, you can just hand wave the movement speed thing and just say, I'm just going to move my full speed on this turn. It can be really useful for people who are getting a little bit over the monotony of, I move half my speed and then I use my action to dash so that I can actually go somewhere on this turn. Sometimes you just kind of want to this turn I'm going to move up there and I'm going to attack. And so that brings me on to the fighting section of underwater. I use basically the same rules for weapons underwater. So if it's a thrusting weapon, no disadvantage. If it is a swinging weapon, obviously you're at disadvantage. Obviously, like Bob the World Builder said in his video, slings make no sense, so I just wouldn't allow you to attack with a sling. And then for ranged weapons like bows and arrows, I'd probably give you disadvantage because of the way that the string is hindered by the water. Javelins and thrown weapons at range, no disadvantage. What I chose to add to the game, though, for combat, to make it not just everything is a detriment and just fighting underwater sucks, I wanted to add some fun bonuses, some benefits to fighting underwater that you don't get when fighting on land. And so I looked at the different magic types, the different damage types that you can do, and I gave each one a little bit of something different. So already in rules as written, everybody has resistance to fire damage. I tweaked that slightly and very subtly by saying instead of everybody gets resistance, I just say all fire damage is halved. That way, if you have resistance to fire damage already, fire damage against you is now quartered. Then I looked at acid and poison, and I thought, underwater, acid and poison would probably be diluted somewhat. If you get a chemical burn on you, you probably want to wash it off pretty quickly with water, and so acid burns on you would probably be diluted. And so acid and poison I also halved, much like fire, but because they are diluting into the water around you, I also doubled their radius. So if it is a single target effect that only affects one person, it now affects that person and one person adjacent to them. If it is a radius of effect, then it now doubles the radius. So for instance, the spell Vitriolic Sphere, which does a radius of I think 20 feet of acid, it's kind of like a fireball but with acid. Instead of doing 20-foot radius, it now does a 40-foot radius, but everybody in that only takes half of the acid damage. Then we move on to cold damage. As anyone who swims often will tell you, moving through cold water is harder than moving through warm water because cold water is more dense. It is harder than hot water. So if you do cold damage to somebody, the target's speed is also reduced by 10 feet. This is very much like the Ray of Frost cantrip that already exists, and it reduces a target's speed by 10 feet. So for that cantrip, you would reduce the target speed by 20 feet. And I kind of theme that as like some frost would freeze over them in the water around them, and they would have to break through that with some of their movement if they want to move. Lightning damage is a fun one, because here's a little physics lesson for you. Water is not actually a good conductor on its own. So if you were in a situation where you were fighting in pure water, I probably wouldn't use this rule because I'm a physics nerd. But it's the impurities in water. Salt water, for instance, very good lightning conductor. So how I rule it is if you deal lightning damage to someone, you pick another target at random from everybody that's within range of that target, including your allies and yourself, and after randomly rolling to see who it is, that person also takes half of the lightning damage of the first guy. It's kind of like turning every lightning spell into a mini chain lightning. Then we have radiant damage. Radiant damage is not just holy, it's sort of also tied in with illumination or glowing or brightness. And I liked thinking about the refractive nature of water. So when you hit somebody with radiant damage, you pick somebody at random within range of that person, and that person becomes blinded for the rest of this turn. And then finally there's thunder damage. Thunder damage and lightning damage are very different, though they are often confused. Lightning is the electricity, and thunder is the sound wave. Thunder is a pressure wave damage, kind of like the concussive blast that emits from any sort of explosion. If you are not hit by the shrapnel of a grenade, the thing that's likely to kill you is actually the explosive force of the grenade. It suddenly will compress the soft tissues in your body and rupture them and cause damage to them. And as seen in this very good physics video, if you're underwater, the concussive blast will do a lot more damage to you than if you're in air. So to represent that, anytime somebody takes thunder damage underwater, they also take an additional d12 thunder damage, which significantly buffs up some very low-level thunder damage spells. So now there's some tactics to fighting underwater. Now, try as I might, I couldn't really think of any water-based buff or debuff for psychic damage or force damage or necromantic damage. If you can think of some that seem to fit in your games, absolutely feel free to chuck them in the comments and use them in your games. So once again, thank you very much to Ginny D and Pointy Hat for starting this event. I look forward to having some sort of homebrewed underwater monster for next year. And as always, have fun telling stories. Hopefully, underwater stories. See you in the next one. Thank you for watching, everybody. I can only make these because of generous support from patrons, so please do consider supporting me over there if you can afford it. I really appreciate it. Thank you.